Everyone, I want to welcome you all to the final webinar in our series, Our Daughters, Our Future, an educational series exploring girls' mental health and wellness. At Gateways, we're working to raise awareness to reduce the stigma around mental illness, and our goal is to give all of us the knowledge and strategies to support our young people. We are so grateful to the Miriam Fund of Boston's Combined Jewish Philanthropy for sponsoring this series. The Miriam Fund is committed to creating a world that expands opportunities for women and girls, and we are thrilled that they will be funding this series again next year. The agenda for the evening is to hear first from Elder, who will share her moving story, followed by our speaker, Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern. We encourage you to use the chat function to the panelists and attendees to ask any questions that you have. And then after Dr. Bar-Halpern speaks, Dr. Rachel Shine will pose the questions that you've asked throughout the presentation. Before I turn over the program to Rachel to introduce our speakers, I want to remind you that you'll be receiving a survey after this program, and we really encourage you to think about topics that you might want to hear in future webinars and hopefully live speaker events next year. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Sharon. So I am thrilled to first introduce young Elder. Oops, my computer just did something. Young Elder is a 19-year-old from Maryland. She got her name because she is wise beyond her years and knows too well that the mental well-being of her city's Black community has been shaped by structural inequality and systemic racism. While grappling with her surroundings, Elder is also coming to terms with her surroundings and vents about her frustrations through rap songs she writes and records with friends. Last year, she was asked to join the city's first trauma-informed care task force run by the mayor's office to help members of her community who are struggling. And in February of 2020, Baltimore became the first US cities to legislate trauma-informed care. So Elder, we are so thrilled to have you join us and to hear your story. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
I'm so excited to be here, and I just want to thank everybody who is here and who is tuning in, because that means you care and I care and we all care. So just to start off with my story, I'm 19, so it's kind of a long story, but I'm gonna make it short. Like Miss Rachel said, I am from Maryland, but I'm from Baltimore. So Maryland and Baltimore is a city in Maryland, but it's a whole different state in itself. There's many things to love about Baltimore, and there's many things to hate about Baltimore. And sometimes for me, the things that are meant for us to hate Baltimore, it just kind of makes me love the city more. So for me, like I said, I grew up in Baltimore, West Baltimore to be exact. When I was younger, I grew up with a single mother. Well, I still am growing up with a single mother, but when I was growing up, my mother got into a car accident and it left her disabled, and she couldn't really use her hand, and she was sick for a long time, and not just sick physically, but sick mentally too. Like, she was depressed from having to be in that accident, and I didn't really know what depression was when I was younger because I never heard of it, and it's not really something that is spoken about in the Black community. So it's kind of just, for me, it would seem like every time I come home, my mother is in the bed, like she don't care about me. But in reality, she was depressed because she just got in an accident. Her life just changed drastically, and it was a lot for her to handle and raise me at the same time. So that's kind of how the trauma first started, unintentionally, because my mother loved me to death, but I definitely was traumatized, seeing her depressed, seeing her sad, seeing her had to go through those ups and downs. So that's kind of how it started. Then as I started to get older, it kind of felt like I in retrospect to myself, it kind of felt like I was raising myself because my dad wasn't really around, and I was kind of struggling with my sexuality, and my mom was sick, and I knew that it was nothing really that I could do to help her because I was young. So, feeling kind of helpless, it really took a toll on my mental health because I want to help my mom. Mind you, I'm also an only child as well. So it's it's kind of hard, feeling like, you can juggle all of those things on your back. But it's okay because that's just where it starts. And that's just how my story got started. As I went to middle school, I was homeschooled for a while, and that's kind of where I learned some of my skills because I learned a lot of things from my mom because she homeschooled me and she raised me. And then I started going to private schools, and then I got into this program called Heart Smiles. And Heart Smiles is an organization in Baltimore that teaches youth about leadership and teaches youth about entrepreneurship and just overall how to be successful. Like Heart Smiles changed my life. Like I said, I struggled with mental health issues when I was growing up, just based on family. And also, I didn't really mention, but growing up in Baltimore is hard. It's really hard. Um, Losing friends to gun violence, having friends whose parents are addicted to drugs, or having parents who are addicted to drugs. I was beneficial enough to not have parents who were addicted to drugs, but I have friends who parents were, and I saw the type of toll that it took on them, and it's really hard. And it makes it kind of feel like you out here alone. So yeah, it's a lot, it's a lot to speak on. But like I said, once I joined Heart Smiles, I was able to really understand what I wanted to do because I understood the problems that were going on in my city. I understood people were getting killed. I understood people were getting arrested for crimes either they didn't commit or it was just unjust. And I understood that these real things are impacting the people in my community. And like I had mentioned, I started going to a private school. Towards the end of my years in high school, when I was at the private school, I had I had to leave that school just because of other related things. But I had to leave that school and I ended up going to a public school. And the thing about the public school is my zone school. So I saw a lot of the kids who actually grew up in my community and they were like a lot different. Like they like it's like I didn't understand why they would smoke. I didn't understand why they were fighting. I didn't understand. I just would be like, oh, are they bad? I didn't understand. But then as I continued to go to this school and I continued to interact with my peers, I understood that the underlying reason behind most of our actions and the reason why most of my peers are getting arrested and making the decisions that they're making is because they don't have any hope. And that kind of ties back to how it's so rough growing up in Baltimore because if all your friends are dying and you don't know what it looks like to be successful, or you don't know what it looks like just to be older, it can be hard to make rational decisions. It can be hard to do things that are in your best interest. If somebody says, oh, smoking is going to give you cancer, but all your friends have passed away, that's not gonna matter. Like it's kind of like it's so many factors that make it difficult sometimes for youth, especially in Baltimore, just to process what's going on. So I'm really fortunate that I've been able to have opportunities to come on platforms like these to kind of speak for the people who haven't had the chance to speak or will never have the chance to speak because the thing about it is we've had to lose a lot of people for us to get to this point. And I really do feel like now is the time for us to really buckle down and help the youth do what they have to do to get their mental health to where it needs to be because that's the only way that we're going to be successful. That's the only way that we're going to be able to prosper because everybody has mental health. It's just about how we approach it. And everybody goes through situations. And I try to tell my friends this like, are you going to be the friend that never has issues? Are you going to be the friend that nothing ever happens to them? Or are you going to be the friend that every single time something happens, they always get back up and they always keep fighting? Like, I feel like that's something better than nothing ever happens to you. So just being able to support the youth and understanding that trauma is real and it's inevitable and it comes in all shapes and forms. It can be small, it can be big. You can't really put a measurement on trauma, but we're all kind of going through it in our own way. And I know that together, through having conversations like these and just being here for each other, that we can help heal one another. So I really appreciate you guys. And yeah.
Thanks, Elder. So, Elder, we had a question come through for you. Somebody would like to know how you found out and got into the program Heart Smiles.
Okay, so it's crazy. So Heart Smiles, I found out about Heart Smiles because once I transferred schools, they had like a back to school fair. And the lady who runs Heart Smiles, named Miss Joni, she came to the school and she was basically saying, like, it's my program, it's called Heart Smiles. I teach about entrepreneurship. You know, if you're interested, just follow me on Instagram at Heart Smiles MD. I'm telling y'all, Heart Smiles, it's the best thing ever. Like, I push doing therapy. I definitely encourage people to do therapy, but having a community and having people who are going to push you, and not only just push you, but hold you accountable when you need to be held accountable, because it takes a lot to do that. And it takes a lot to be able to accept criticism or accept anything. So just having a community of people who you know are all driven to be successful, because we understand the circumstances, and we understand, since Heart Smiles is a program that comes straight out of Baltimore, you know, we understand that tomorrow is not promised. So we got to go as hard as we can right now so that we can do what we can to influence the people around us. So yeah, Heart Smiles MD on Instagram. I'm telling y'all, we got Winning Wednesdays and we got Thriving Thursdays. If you just want to come and you want to talk about success, you want to talk about failure, we could talk about failure too, because everybody fails. You know, just follow them on Instagram.
Yeah. One other question. What are your plans for the future?
It's so crazy that you asked me that. I have no idea. I really, like, lately, that's kind of what's been racking my brain, having me a little bit stressed, because I've always been the type of person, I like to plan stuff out. I like to know, like, what I'm gonna do, what's the next step. And lately things just kind of been like this. So, you know, I'm kind of just taking it, taking it day by day. You know, like I said, I have a business called Quarantine Delights. My sister and I, we make food. That's something I'm doing right now, but my sister about to go to college in Atlanta. Like I said, I live in Baltimore, so I don't know how that will work. And mind you, it's called Quarantine Delights. We're not going to be quarantined forever. So, you know, just trying to take it day by day. I love the youth. I love the people in my city. And I love just helping people. And I love helping people get to where they need to be. So I don't know. Wherever God leads my feet, that's where I'm gonna go.
Thank you so much, Elder, for sharing your story. I really, really appreciate it. And all of the amazing things that you've done in your advocacy. So
thank you. No problem.
And Elder's gonna hang around in the background. So certainly if you have future questions for her, feel free to put them in the chat. So I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern. Miri is the Director of Intensive Outpatient Treatment Services at the Boston Child Study Center and a clinical instructor at Harvard Medical School. In addition, she is a psychologist at McLean Hospital. And Miri earned her bachelor's degree at Tel Aviv University and comes to us originally from Israel, and earned her doctorate. We went to graduate school together, so she earned her doctorate from the University of Hartford, the clinical psychology doctoral program with highest honors. So Dr. Bar-Halpern, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And Edler, what a pleasure to hear you talk. I think that I'm going to use some of the examples you gave actually, so that's great to have you talking before me. Let's see if that's going to work. It's always the magic. Rachel, can everybody see the screen?
We can see your screen.
Perfect.
You're good.
Okay. Can you still see it, or did I? So we're going to talk about trauma today. I know it's not the lightest thing to talk about, but I think specifically now with the world that we live in, there's so much trauma going on, compound layers on layers. And I want to focus about trauma-informed care and really talk about how do we move from surviving trauma to thriving. So we're going to talk a little bit about trauma, what type of traumas are there, diagnosis, what are the symptoms according to different age groups. We're going to talk about trauma in the brain, transgenerational trauma, so that's trauma within the family, trauma and attachment. We're going to talk about resilience and post-traumatic growth. Again, we're going to go over some intervention and focus on trauma-informed school and compassion fatigue, because you can never have anything without it. So what is trauma? Trauma is basically taken from the Greek word to describe a wound. And the way I think about trauma, it's really a wound within a person's soul. It's a traumatic event, and it can affect the child development. It can affect cognition, social skills, personality, self-esteem, attention span, self-concept, and so much more. When we think about trauma, we have different types of traumas per definition. We have acute trauma, which is a single traumatic event that can be an accident, a natural disaster, a single assault. There is traumatic grief, when we lose someone that is really important to us, like a parent or a sibling. There is chronic trauma, which are multiple traumatic events. Those are different events and not just one long one. It can be either or. And then we have complex trauma. So complex trauma are multiple traumatic events that are chronic, and they're usually within the caregiving system. So it can be a parent or a different caretaker, and they start early in childhood. So 2 out of 3 children have experienced at least one traumatic event. 2 out of 3 children. That's a lot. Out of this population, 13.4 will go and develop PTSD symptoms. Now, most people can actually recover from a traumatic event, and they will develop either resiliency or post-traumatic growth, and we'll talk about the difference between the two later. But others might develop chronic emotional and behavioral and physical difficulties, and might have full PTSD. Other than trauma, or PTSD, say, there is something that's called adverse childhood experience. Those are basically experiences that happens in early childhood, 0 to 17 years old, and it can be anything that changing the environment. So anything that can undermine someone's safety, stability, and attachment. Violence, abuse, neglect, having a family member attempt or die from suicide, substance misuse, mental health problem. It can be a separation, a parent, caregiver go to jail. It can be bullying at school. So there's different experiences that people go through between those years. And what we found out is that the more ACEs that you have, adverse childhood experience, the more likely you are to have more chronic medical condition, chronic stress, and more vulnerable to develop also full PTSD. So as I mentioned, there's different type of risk factors that come with ACEs, sexually transmitted infection, teen pregnancy. Some will be involved in sex trafficking, chronic disease, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and the list go on and on. One of the things to remember is that it's really that factor of having multiple diagnoses. So it's not just that someone was exposed to an adverse event, but it can also develop depression, and on top of that, anxiety. And on top of that, we have those medical conditions. So we really want to think about the person is holistic and not just per one event. Some of the symptoms that we see with childhood that have been experienced trauma or ACEs is helplessness. The helplessness and stress actually become the normal state of being. So think about a situation like the last time you felt really, really scared. Your heart is beating really fast. Maybe your hands are sweating. You're feeling lightheaded. Maybe you're freezing or you're numb. You don't know what to do because you saw, let's say, a big bug if you're scared of bugs, like a real fear response. But then it ends, right? Like you have a full cycle of fear and stress, and then it stops. For people who experience trauma, this never stops. So the cycle keeps on and on and on, and it gets a toll on your body and on your soul. So that's where we see that helplessness and stress. There are depressive symptoms, anxiety, behavioral changes, difficulty with self-regulation. So self-regulation is emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, and behavioral regulation. Then we have problems relating to others, so trusting other people, forming different relationships. It could be regression, loss of previously acquired skills. So we see a lot of kids that experience trauma and all of a sudden they start having a body accident, for example, or more separation anxiety. Attention, academic difficulties, nightmares, difficulty sleeping in general, maybe not eating, maybe eating too much, and then there are some physical symptoms. With teenagers, the picture is a bit more complicated. So we have all of those other symptoms, but then adolescence is a very critical part of development. So during those years, they're trying to also develop their identity. And when trauma occurs during the teenage years, the whole sense of self can really change. So we also have the flashback, avoidance of different activities, the sleep disturbance, like before anxiety and depression. But then we also have risky behavior. We have substance abuse, we have impulse control, and we have self-harming behavior.
Miri,
Yeah.
when you think about kind of childhood trauma, can a child develop trauma issues if a parent has chronic disease that demands constant attention? That's a question from a participant.
Yes, so, and we'll get to that. So that will be something about transgenerational trauma. But when we have a parent that has their own ACEs or their own narrative, they might be less attuned to the kid. So even if there's not specific neglect or abuse, there might be as a secondary trauma. Yes, and we're definitely going to touch that as well.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So with complex trauma, we see a little bit more of the symptoms because think about a situation when someone is being traumatized by the person who's supposed to care for them, right? So when a kid is being born, basically all of their needs are based on their parents or their caregivers. And if the trauma, the neglect, the abuse is happening by someone within the family, then the thoughts that those kids have might be, I'm unlovable, I'm not worth caring for, the whole world is unsafe. So then we really see a change also in personality sometimes. There's uncertainty about how can I trust the world or what's going on in the world. There's low self-esteem, and there's a lot of shame and guilt. I did it to myself. That must be my fault because why would my parents or my caretaker would not care for me? There are also situations with poor boundaries, and that means more physical boundaries. Social isolation, difficulty taking other people's perspective and attuning to other people's emotions. So basically mentalizing other people's perspectives. And then there are other situations with sensory-motor developmental problems. We have a lot, kind of like a holistic approach of how trauma really affects the body and the personality from the beginning of childhood.
Miri, can you define an omen? You referred on the previous slide to omens. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we're thinking more about cognitions and how we, let me see, how will I define omen? So those will be situations when I have a certain belief and then I see this in a very black and white kind of way. And this is how things are. And it might be, like when we talk about time distortion, this is how I view the reality, that the time is different. And it might be more about a situation that occurred and this is how I see it. For example, this happened because of me. I brought it on myself. I'm a bad person.
Well, thank you.
I think I saw another question, but for some reason I can't see my screen very well.
That's okay. I was going to type the answer, but if you would like to answer it, the participant asked, can you define sensory motor? What is sensory motor?
Yes. Rachel, I'm having a hard time with actually seeing you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yes, because I pinned you. So
Okay.
I can remove, but I can remove that so you can see me.
No, that's fine.
Can you see me now?
No, I cannot, and I can't.
That's weird. All right. Well, that's okay. I'm monitoring the chat. So if you want to just answer the question of what sensory motor is.
Yeah. So sensory motor will basically be touch, for example, or if I go on my hand, I can, and I close my eyes, I can detect where my finger is. The problem with sensory motor would be not being able to regulate from sensory perspective. So anything when you think about the different senses that we have, it can be hearing, it can be touch, it can be swallowing. So anything that is related to the five senses might be dysregulated. So really thinking about body sensation.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Let's see, what do we have here? Okay, so more symptoms of complex trauma, because there's so much. So we also have impairment in affect regulation, which is basically mood regulation, for emotional regulation, so it's recognizing what other people are feeling, recognizing what I'm feeling, being able to regulate that, and then being able to communicate that to others as well. So one of the things I often hear from clients is if I ask them, how do you feel today? And they become really overwhelmed because they have no clue how they're feeling. Everything is overwhelming, it's everywhere. And it's hard to say, oh, I'm feeling sadness or I'm feeling anxiety, because it feels just out of control. And then we have formulations of impulses, so self-destructive behavior, that's sleep disturbance, eating, substance abuse, and oppositional behaviors. So those will be the kids that you're kind of going to see off the chart in the classroom, right? They're going to be the kids that will maybe be rude or will push someone else or will not know their boundaries. And we might see them as oppositional and they're not listening, but actually they have underlying trauma. We have cognitive impairments, learning difficulties, and I'm going to talk about it more later, poor attention, and just general executive functioning tasks difficulties. So trauma in the brain, and don't be scared when you hear the word brain, but I do think it's really important to talk about it and kind of understand how it works. So when you think about the brain develops from the bottom up and inside out, which means the first parts of the brain that are going to develop are the parts that are going to relate to surviving. So that is the brainstem, this little part over here on the bottom. And the brainstem is in charge of all of our body functioning. So heart rate, temperature, breathing, really trying to regulate that. It's motor control, it's related to sleep. So really think about how am I alive? That's the brainstem. And then the second part is the limbic system. And in the limbic brain, which is the kind of like the middle of brain, we have the amygdala, the hypothalamus, we have the thalamus, we have the hippocampus, and all those fancy names. And basically what it does, we have a relationship between memory, we have the emotional aspect. So when something happened, this is the part of the brain that remembers and gives it emotional meaning. And then this is also the survival mechanism, so the fight or flight response. So when someone experiences trauma, the limbic system is overly activated. It's basically telling our brainstem, you need to work right now. We're in danger, fight or flight. Let's get the system going. We either are going to, if we think about back then when we had to fight the mammoth and we were cavemen and we had a split second to decide, are we going to run away? Are we going to fight? Or maybe we're just going to play dead. So the limbic system is the one who's telling us what to do. However, because it happens super, super fast, the limbic system takes over and the frontal lobe, which is the top part over here, shuts down. So when someone experiences trauma, they can't really enter that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that's in charge of executive functioning, problem solving, learning, focusing, Broca areas over there. So that's the part of communicating to other. All of that is just shut completely down. So part of the work that we're trying to do with clients who experience trauma is helping them get out of their limbic brain, out of the survival brain, and tap into their prefrontal cortex, or at least get it more activated. So a few points to take home when you think about the brain is, like I mentioned before, we all experience fear, right? We all had that moment of pure terror. Maybe it was when you were at the park with your kid and you were talking with a friend, and then all of a sudden you're looking and your kid is not in the swing anymore. And you're like, oh my God, what just happened? That feeling, that terror feeling, some of us cannot stop that cycle. And then trauma lives in the survival brain and the limbic brain. It's a loss of top-down control. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that helps us control. This part is shut down during trauma. However, the brain can change, so there is always hope. And healing occurs when we learn to regulate the limbic system, the middle part of the brain, and activate the prefrontal cortex. I'm going to talk about how to do it. And then I want you to think about that. Living in the prefrontal cortex is a privilege, and some of us don't have this privilege. So when you think about areas where people grow up in more traumatizing environment, either poverty, racism, war, terror, people do not have access to their prefrontal cortex. So how does that work? How does this mechanism of trauma work? So during a traumatic event, we give emotional meaning to what happened. So that's, again, the limbic system. We might feel powerless, fear, disgust. We have thoughts during that time, like I won't survive, I wish I was dead, why is this happening to me? And then we feel things, sensation in the body. And it can be pain, it can be nauseous, and can also be sexual arousal for some people. Those are primary emotion, and they're related directly to the event. I feel it during the event itself. But then I need to make sense of the event. So with time, we develop our own assumption and our own kind of hypothesis about why did it happen? Why did it happen to me? It's my fault. I'm a bad person. I'm different. There is shame, there is guilt coming into it. So people that experience trauma having difficulty separating the secondary memories and sensation and thoughts from the primary emotions and events. So it's becoming this network where we have the traumatic event in the middle. And the traumatic event is, let's say if I was in a car accident, that will be the car accident, right? So I might be feeling pain. I might be feeling that fear. I'm going to think, oh my God, I'm going to die. Then there is a memory of the event. I'm telling my close friend about what happened and I'm reliving it. And then there are direct reminders. For example, every time I go into my car or every time I'm driving somewhere, I'm thinking I was in a car accident. But then there are indirect reminders, and those are interesting. So it could be, for example, a situation where I entered a room and I start feeling shaky and my heart is beating really, really fast and I'm feeling nauseous and I don't know why. And I see the color blue, but for some reason, the color blue makes me feel horrible. Well, this may be an indirect reminder of the trauma. Maybe the last thing I saw before I blocked out or during the car accident was a blue car. So making those connections is important because if we know our trauma reminders, we can stop avoiding situations. So during a traumatic event, someone might feel helplessness, basically not having control, and then experience a primary emotion. That's the trauma. Then we said they need to combat the helplessness, right? We need to, nobody likes to sit with helplessness, basically. So we want to make the trauma more tolerable. So then we have those secondary emotion and secondary thoughts about what happened. So the trauma symptoms are basically our mind attempt to avoid the sense of helplessness and the sense of loss of control. But then those techniques, this avoidance or escape, becoming the actual problem. So this is just another way of thinking about it. When we have a traumatic event or a traumatic invalidation. So traumatic invalidation is when someone needs are being blocked. And it can be something subtle like, let's say a kid comes from school and gets the sense from his parents that his feelings don't matter. Every time he says, I'm scared, just get over it. It's not a big deal, just get over it. Or if they disclose trauma and the environment is basically telling them it's not a big deal, this will be considered traumatic invalidation. So when needs are being, when we can meet our needs, we feel a sense of sadness plus out of control, and it's being conditioned together. So then the feeling of out of control, as you can see here, is sometimes masking the sadness. So people that experience trauma or traumatic invalidation, all they feel is the helplessness, and sometimes they can't tolerate the sadness. But because helplessness is something that we cannot tolerate, we have our own mechanism, our mind is playing tricks on us, and then we go to secondary emotion. And the three big ones, the literature shows, is anxiety, which means I'm going to avoid the situation. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to sense it. I'm going to run away. There is anger. I'm going to attack you before you're attacking me. So those are people that might show aggression, irritability, isolation. And then the ultimate way of gaining control or explaining to myself why something happened is shame. If I wake up every morning and I blame myself and I tell myself, I'm a horrible person, this is all my fault, I'm in control. I can give myself an explanation to why this is happening to me. So there are some protective factors, some vulnerability factors. And as I mentioned before, not everybody is going to experience all the different levels of symptoms of trauma. There is the personality, there is temperament, our biological composition, pre-existing vulnerability, the age it happened, gender, culture, proximity to the event. There's a really interesting research that was done about people who were directly exposed to 9/11 and people who read about 9/11. And whilst both groups showed that they have some trauma symptoms, the ones who were more directly exposed show more trauma symptoms as well.
So Miri,
Yep.
we had a question come through. One came through that I'm going to have you answer later when you talk about intergenerational trauma. But one that is relevant to what you're talking about now is how common is disassociation following trauma? And I wonder if you could talk when you answer that question about what it looks like, how we all kind of have different levels of disassociation at different points. So
sure, this is not working for me. I'm gonna stop share and share again because it's not working well.
okay.
Okay, let me read the question, it might be easier.
The question is, how common is disassociation following trauma?
It is very common. So when you think of dissociation, this is basically our mind way of escaping or avoiding, right? So dissociation is basically that feeling that I'm not here. This is not reality. It can happen during trauma. So this is kind of like our brain of my way of surviving is if I'm just pretending that I'm not here. And it keeps happening after the event as well as a way of managing the flashbacks, because what happened in flashback is reliving the traumatic event. So every time there is a trigger, like we talked about that big circles. So even if there's indirect reminder or direct reminder, for some people, their mind gets into that fight or flight freeze mode and they just dissociate. So it's very, very common.
Great. And I think also it's important to know that everybody dissociates a little bit, right? And if you think about the experience of like you get somewhere and you can't remember how you got there, that's a form of dissociation. So individuals who have experienced trauma dissociate way more frequently and more severely. So while we're going back and forth a little bit, somebody once asked a question about how early can trauma begin?
Very early, but just back to what you're saying, Rachel, because it's so true. So every part of those symptoms that you're saying is a spectrum, right? So when I said before, escape and avoidance, it can be a healthy way of coping, but to what extent? So when the escape and the avoidance become the problem, then we know that we need to do something about it. Absolutely. How early can trauma begin? Very early. We see there's research about people, babies I think there was a big research about orphanage in Romania, for example, right? That babies that were neglected, and they saw this kind of like numbness. There was a big research done by Piaget, basically, that was talking about the different critical developmental periods of life, and how someone that experienced neglect during that early years really missing big hallmarks of development. So the earlier that the trauma occur, the more symptoms we're probably going to see later as well.
Right. And I think one of the things, that is so consistent with what you're saying is that oftentimes we see trauma looks like so many other things. And so, oftentimes we see kids diagnosed with ADHD who are in your classrooms who are, or may have behavioral difficulties, and what's at the root of their challenges is trauma.
Exactly. And we're definitely going to address it. I'm going to talk about trauma-sensitive school, because I think that's where we fall short as a society, and we can definitely do more.
Great. All right.
Try to share it again. See if it's going to work. Is it working?
It is working.
Okay.
All right. Is it working for you?
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about intergenerational trauma. And, this topic is so interesting, especially right now. So I work with a lot of clients from the Jewish community and Israelis and immigrants. And with the rise of anti-Semitism, we really see that network coming to life. So when I say the network we talked about before, this trauma network, where you have the secondary emotions and the primary emotion, when something triggering that system, the whole network is being triggered. So for someone, it might seem like, what's the big deal? Like, why are you so upset about this one comment? But you never know what's behind that comment. And maybe for that specific individual, it sits on years and years of invalidation or different traumatic experiences. So what we're seeing right now is increase of people who had experienced trauma before, and with the rise of anti-Semitism around the US and around the world, they're feeling that I'm unsafe again and I feel powerless. And even if it's not directly happening to me, it reminds me of events that happened either within my family, to my grandparents, and so on. So what we know about people who experience trauma, the caregivers, if they're occupied with their own traumatic memories, and they're not able to accurately respond and reflect to their children. So, Ella was talking before after her mother accident, and her mom was depressed, and it was hard to sit with it. That's a great example of intergenerational trauma, when obviously her mom didn't do anything on purpose, but there was a cause and effect, and the fact that she wasn't able to meet Adler's needs definitely added to the concept of trauma. So we have the child experience on one hand. So there is a loss or missing needs, and there is sadness. And then we have the parent experience. And when you combine sadness with this feeling of out of control, you get into those anxiety, anger, and shame. And you get to depression as well. So the way to think about it is this, I like to think about it as a cycle. So you have, let's take an example of a parent that experienced domestic violence or trauma that is related to violence. So you have a situation, we have a parental dysregulation. So the parents cannot regulate their own emotions, and that might lead to disturbance of the attachment. It might not be attuned to the kids' needs. One of our jobs as parents is to really reflect back emotions, so kids will learn how to regulate their own emotions. And if I'm preoccupied with how I'm feeling and I'm not able to do it for myself, then my child never learns how to do that. So then children have poor affect dysregulation, and then maybe the child tantrums, maybe they're becoming aggressive toward the caregiver. So then that can serve as a trauma reminder for the parent. And again, they might feeling helpless, their trauma network is being activated. So then in return, they're going to physically remove themselves from the situation, from the child, or maybe they will respond with aggression back. And that's going to increase the child's sense of helplessness, decrease the sense of self-worth, and then there's going to be the trust trauma network that's going to be activated. So who am I going to trust? Who's going to help me? And again, it's not the parent's fault, right? But when we think about our parental role, part of it is learning how to put the oxygen mask on us first. So what we know is that traumatized children that have a secure attachment are more resilient. And a secure attachment is basically a child that knows that they have a caregiver that they can trust, that it will meet their basic needs. And you just need one person in your life to create a secure attachment. And then traumatized children that have insecure attachment are more likely to experience stress reaction because they don't have enough support. And there are just, some interesting research. There was a lot of research that was done with Holocaust survivors in second and third generation. So we know that children of Holocaust survivor were more likely to develop PTSD when they experience traumatic experience. So for example, if they had to go to war or in car accidents or things like that, they were more vulnerable to PTSD and to stress in general. And we know that compared to offerings of non-survivors, they actually presented with more depression, more anxiety, more maladaptive behavior, some personality problems, and so on. So even if they did not experience trauma per se, they still had those secondary components of mental illness as well. And then we have this really interesting phenomena. It's called the concentration camp survivor syndrome. And those are people that offerings of survivor that were never at the camps, but they present at the face of stress as if they were in the concentration camp themselves. They describe almost like flashbacks and situation as if they were actually there. And I think it really speaks to the parent component. So those might be offerings of survivors who talked about the trauma a lot and really relived that at home. So I can say, so I'm a third generation Holocaust survivor, and just, growing up in my environment, both of my grandparents, both sides, had very different ways of managing their trauma. And I had one side of my family that we never talk about it. We're avoiding at all costs. It happened over there. We're not going to bring it up. And then we have the other side of the family that relived it again and again, and everything was about the Holocaust and second generation. So my dad, for example, so he grew up with the parent that would never talk about trauma, became a psychiatrist. that his specialty is Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. And the other side was more about my grandmother, who always talked about the Holocaust. There was a lot of anxiety there. And then my mom grew up with a lot of anxiety. We're not allowed to go to the beach or get a driver license. You have to finish all the food from your plate and stuff like that. And she took it to make sure that me and my brother will never experience that. So you can see how it really goes on within the family. And then, second generation, definitely third generation. And again, I'm thinking now with this new reality, what type of symptoms we're going to see as well. And again, just bringing it back to the body and physiological aspect. So there is definitely a biological mechanism of trauma. Yehuda is a big researcher that is researching cortisol level, and she found a correlation between maternal, so mother with PTSD symptoms, and then lower cortisols in their infants, and for them, if they were pregnant during 9/11, were directly affected by 9/11. So there is a connection between low cortisol levels. So cortisol is that hormone in our body that is related to stress in both mothers and their infants. So think about it. A baby, an infant that was not actually there when it happens, it was still in the womb, is already vulnerable to trauma. So back to the question, when does trauma start? I'm actually going to take back what I said. It doesn't even start as a baby. It starts when the sperm meets the egg. There's so many vulnerability factors that can happen back then, right? Like when we think about the neural tube in the brain, which is basically the blueprints of the brain, so many things can go wrong when our parents are exposed to trauma or to adverse childhood experience. So some people are already born with vulnerability. Before they're even born, there is vulnerability there. So just a word about resilience. Rachel, how are you doing with time, by the way?
You are good. You have about, we have about 40 minutes left. So, yeah.
Okay. So resilience and post-traumatic growth. So resiliency is this, there is a researcher that calls it, her name is Maston, and she calls it common magic. It's basically the ability to bounce back from adverse experiences and to be able to cope with it. So again, think about a situation where I'm moving from my limbic system to my prefrontal cortex. I'm surviving. And then there is post-traumatic growth, which is different. So that would be giving meaning to the event. There is a great author, Judith Eger, Dr. Eger, that wrote the book, The Gift. And in the book, she really talks about how giving meaning, and she was in concentration camp and met Viktor Frankl, who I'm sure you've heard about, but she really talks about how when you give meaning to the experience, now you're moving from just surviving to thriving. And I say it all the time. There was a case in the news in Israel about a woman who was almost murdered by her husband, and then she was saved by a neighbor who heard the screams, and it was brutal. It was one of the situations that the whole country heard about. And she started giving talks and very quickly showed up. And I mean, her face was butchered. And she was daring to scream and looking back to people and educating and telling people what are some of the red flags and what to do. That is giving meaning. Think about people who lost their child and then becomes advocate for whatever cause it is related to losing that child. That is giving meaning. So then a word about interventions. Rachel, are there any questions before I move to interventions about any of the previous material?
Yes. So, and this is a really hard question to answer, but I will answer to ask you anyway. Given that one ACE is having a family member or parent incarcerated, and the BIPOC folks are disproportionately incarcerated, how does this perpetuate the experience of trauma intergenerationally, as well as health disparities in communities most impacted by mass incarceration? Mm-hmm. And then the second part of the question is, what kind of policy can we advocate for that makes the case for common sense that our tax dollars will be better spent on programs like Elders' beloved Heart Song? So,
what a great question. So there is actually a really, really interesting initiative I gave a talk about a few months ago in Ohio. There is a lot of advocacy there in terms of the jail system. So I was contacted by a prisoner from there who got a hold of my book. I wrote a children's book for children who experience trauma, and it's an interactive book. And he contacted me, and he said that he started, again, giving meaning to an event. He started an organization that's called Book for Bruises. And what he found out when he was incarcerated is that, and he's an African-American individual from grew up in poverty, and he realized that he never learned how to write, and he never had access to education. And when he was in prison, he learned how to write, and he read about trauma. And he created this organization to really educate and help other children for the love of reading, but also to promote racial injustice around the jail system. And when you think about that, remember that slide about ACEs, so the adverse childhood experience, that's the big one, right? So when a caretaker goes to prison, the child is being left with that feeling of what is going on, right? Like, what did my parents do, and why is this more important than me? They can't, and the younger they are, it's more difficult for them to really understand the concept, and they might take it personally. So when you think of emotions, right, emotions are basically signals. They're signals to different things that are going on. And a good one to think about is, for example, disgust, right? So children who experience disgust can, let's say they were sexually abused, they feel disgust in their body, they can't differentiate between disgust in the body to I am disgusting. So it works in the same way. So if my caretaker left me, even if it wasn't their choice, I'm going to internalize it like it's my fault, most likely. And it goes back to that separation. And of course, there's also the other type of violence that's going on within this community. So there's actually a lot of research and different policies that are going on. And Rachel, I can send you at the end of this presentation a few links for people if they want to learn and read more about it.
That would be
a lot that we can do, for sure. And especially when you go back to thinking about, this is why I highlight the brain so much. I'm not that nerdy that I just love the brain. But when you think about it, well, I am. But when you think about it, we never know who's the person behind, right? So we never know what they bring to the table and whether or not they experience trauma already as infants, or maybe they're more vulnerable even from before they were born because what their parents have been through. So it's really important when we're thinking about policies, when we're thinking about schooling environment, when we're treating other people, how can we adapt what we're doing to be adequate for everybody and not just who we have in mind. And so I think we'll talk about more when we get to the school piece. I think it's a very interesting topic.
Great, thank you. I put somebody asked for the link to your book, so I put it, the Amazon link. And was the other organization you were talking about called Books for Bruises?
Book for Bruises, yep.
Books for Bruises, great.
Fabulous person. And thank you, Liara, that you love the brain. It makes me feel very validated.
The brain is amazing.
Yes. Okay, so back to our interventions. Okay, so when we think about intervention, or more what I like to call evidence-based intervention, things that we want to make sure that are there for every person. We have psychoeducation about trauma, really explaining that mechanism, how it works, myth and stuff like that. Identification of emotions. Again, think about people that cannot understand what they're feeling in their body. It's a feeling of out of control, so helping them putting a name to it. Coping skills to regulate emotion, sensation, and cognition. If you're a clinician, you would do exposure, and there is in vivo, meaning exposure, kind of like real life exposure, versus imaginal exposure, which is reminding, going through the memory of the trauma again and again. There is attachment component, family therapy, parent coaching. Want to build a safe, supportive environment for the child. The intervention needs to be creative and, of course, adaptive to the different levels, developmental levels. So we're going to talk about a case. I'm going to talk about one of my previous clients. We're going to call her Anna. Yep.
Mary, just one quick question for you. So how can you know when helping a traumatized child if it is helpful to expose slowly to help cope, or if you should let the child come along in their own time?
What a great question. I think that's the magic of being a therapist. You kind of need to feel it, right? So there is this balance between, first of all, it's personal style, but there's also a balance between respecting the space, giving, especially people with trauma, giving them the control to say stop when things are too much, and being able to constantly bring it back to the network system and reflect, you're avoiding right now. It's your choice if you want to keep avoiding, and you're avoiding right now. So I call it compassionate push. At least that's the style that I tend to use. And I do it out of respect to my clients and to show them that they can do it. Sometimes they feel that they cannot do it because it's so overwhelming, and we do it literally a word by word, a step by step, and we'll stop every time. And we'll use different techniques. I have clients on a balance board telling their story to regulate themselves, or I would do push-ups with them sometimes, with my heels, with my dress, just push-ups. You do what you need. If you believe in this type of treatment, which I do believe in exposure work, you make it work for the individual. So it's that balance between following a manual and following the individual in the room.
Right. Yeah, I would totally agree with you. And there's so much evidence-based research about interventions for trauma, and then clinicians bring in their own style, and you follow the lead of the client. Exactly. And the child. I have had kids tell their story through, art or sports, and it's really, I totally couldn't agree more about, meeting the kid where they're at. But also you can't, it's like doing the most aversive thing for us as adults, right? If we're not pushed a little bit, we're not going to do it. So they do need that push.
Exactly. So it's really balancing that and pacing it as needed as well, of course. And again, there's different type of interventions for that. I mean, we have TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more for younger kids, and it's really a workbook, and it's writing your narrative, recording your narrative, versus a technique that I love to use. It's called DBT PTSD, where you have the person retell their story again and again, and you record that, and then they need to watch the recording. So I mean, there's a lot of different type of intervention. There is some people do EMDR, which is more related to eye movement. And I think as long as you're following, if you're a clinician, you're following an evidence-based intervention while seeing the person in the room, then it will work. Okay. Back to share screen. I lost my slides. There it is. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to talk about Anna. She's one of my former clients, and at the time I was seeing her, she was 16 years old. She was stepped down from inpatient psychiatric unit. SIB means self-injurious behavior. So she was self-harming since she was about 13 years old, about 3 times per week. Her family history. So Anna grew up with, her parents were never married. She was with her mom before that recent hospitalization, and her mom is a heroin addict who basically sold Anna. She used her, let some of her boyfriends rape her and sexually abuse her to buy drugs. They were homeless for a really long time. They were living in a car, lots of traumatic invalidation, verbally abused by mom, repeatedly was told that she's worthless, and so on. So at some point, her father found out that she was homeless, and he decided to take custody. Mom didn't even fight, gave him custody, and she moved in with dad and his wife, so stepmom. Dad and stepmom at that point have 2 other kids of their own, and then Anna was revealing her traumatic history. She's pretty defined at home. She is breaking the rules. She's sneaking out of the house. She's stealing, lying. And stepmom had a really hard time with her as well, and basically was telling us that she doesn't love her, she doesn't want her there. So a lot of rejection. And one of the things that Anna was saying when she was self-harming is, when I hold a knife, I have control. It helps me forget all the horrible things that have happened. So this is her way of gaining back control or regulating herself in a way. So we started with psychoeducation. So we talked about numbers, how many people have experienced sexual abuse and neglect. We talked about her own beliefs and ways to rethink about them. I explained about the fight, flight, freeze response, like how the brain works. We talked about risk factors, and then we get into emotions as signals. So like I mentioned before, every emotion tells us something. So we were using skills to help her identify emotions and then communicate the emotions. And we talked about that already. Another technique that we used is CBT. So that's from cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy is really trying to understand a person's core beliefs. Those are the kind of like what I really think deep inside about myself. So that might be I'm unlovable, I'm a bad person, I'm worthless. Then we have thinking traps. So those are the beliefs that comes from those core beliefs. So an example might be, if I have the core belief, I'm a horrible person, and I'm seeing two of my peers during recess talking and laughing, my thinking trap might be, they're talking about me right now. They're making fun of me, even if I don't have any evidence of that. So what we practice is basically flexible thinking, or kind of like becoming a detective and checking your facts and checking to see whether or not your thoughts match what actually is going on. So this is an example of a thought that Anna had. If my mother didn't care enough about me, no one will. So we identify what type of thinking trap it is, which call all or nothing or fortune telling. And then we use the detective thinking. Is there anyone who cares about you? And she was able to say my father, my therapist, my teacher, and my friend. We use a technique called double standard, which is what will you tell a friend? So a lot of times we tend to show more compassion toward other people. So if you put yourself in a friend's shoes, what would you tell a friend? And we use shades of gray. So if you can't really change the whole thought, can you change part of the thought? Like some people care about me and others don't care. So I wasn't going to tell her, your mom cared about you. You're just imagining that, because it happened. Her mother did not care about her, but helping her see that some people do care about her. And that's a really important thing to think about. When you do any type of trauma therapy, you're not eliminating the trauma. You cannot do what's done. If someone experienced trauma, the trauma is not going to go away, but you're rewriting on it. So it's almost like a coding on top of that. So it's a new learning behavior. I'm learning that the memory cannot hurt me. I'm learning that what happened to me was in the past and it cannot help. It's not going to hurt me anymore, but I'm not going to take away the actual trauma. We use DBT skills. So DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy. And a few of the skills that we have, so we have acceptance skills, so accepting what happened. And then we have mindfulness and stress tolerance, and we have change skills. So how do I change situations? And those are emotion regulation, interpersonal effectiveness skills, and also mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is basically increasing awareness and acceptance to how things are right now without judgment. So I'm bringing my attention back again and again to the here and now. Think about our brain or our mind as like a puppy, right? That you take him for a walk. It's like, ooh, what's over there? Ooh, a piece of candy. Ooh, what is this flower? Mindfulness is basically training our puppy, our brain, to be present. And why is it important for a trauma survivor? Trauma survivor, their brain keeps going back to the trauma. They're reliving it. So we want to help them again activate the prefrontal cortex and reduce the limbic system. And mindfulness research show that it really helps doing that. It's bringing it back to here. And the non-judgmental part is really important, because if I'm going to judge myself for not being able to do it, then it's not going to be helpful. So it's noticing a thought. I'm thinking about the trauma right now, and I'm bringing my attention back to whatever I'm doing in this specific moment. So Anna actually found mindfulness very, very difficult and annoying. She did not want to do it. And with time, she was more open to it. And we use this type of an activity. It's called changing the script. So changing the script is when you help someone understanding that they're looking at a situation from like the old version of the movie, from the trauma network. And if you're noticing the trauma network and you can put the new script on, meaning the new movie, accepting that I'm not there right now, I'm in this reality, then you're able to go back and forth and change the script. So again, I'm not taking away the trauma, it's there, but I'm recognizing that I'm not there right now, I'm in this reality. Another thing about mindfulness is that according to DBT, we believe there are 3 states of mind. We have our rational mind. So those are people that overthink about stuff, constantly rationalizing. There's not really a lot of emotions involved. It's just knowledge, and trying to focus just on the thoughts. Then we have the emotional mind. So those are people that just react to emotions, basically. Maybe they're tantruming, maybe they're on the fight-flight response. And what we're trying to get into is the wise mind. So wise mind is that state that takes emotions and thoughts together into account when making decisions. So to get to wise mind, we use mindfulness. And a really interesting research shows that, again, the brain, there is an area in the brain that it's between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system that was recognized as someone's wise mind when they did MRI studies. So this area is activated when we're engaging in mindfulness. So this is a little bit more about mindfulness. So we use, the big thing to take from it is that we use wise mind to discriminate between stimuli. So that might be when someone is having a flashback, being able to say, this is not real reality right now, this is the past, and bringing your attention back. And then we have the stress tolerance skills. So those are skills when I'm in crisis. Those are not skills to change how I'm feeling. Those are skills to make sure that things are not getting worse. So survival skills to move us from emotional mind. Those are short-term solution. Usually there will need to be another skill going after that. That's when the limbic system is so activated that I can't even do breathing sometimes. And I can't do the cognitive stuff that I showed you before. So those are the stress tolerance skills. And just a few examples, we're not going to go over all of them. TIP skills is a big one. So everything in DBT is an acronym. So TIP stands for temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and progressive muscle relaxation. Now, I'm mentioning those skills because my understanding is a lot of you are parents, teachers, not just clinicians, and those are skills that everyone can benefit with. So when I do parent coaching, I teach parents the same skill and ask them do it yourself, because you need to put the oxygen mask on you first. And you're modeling that behavior to your child. You're modeling that you're using skills. And then if the child is in crisis, hand them an ice pack. So temperature, basically, it works from the body. So bottom up intervention. If some of you ever scuba dive, what happens with ice diving, our brain basically is being tricked to think that it's underwater. So in scuba diving, our heart rate slows down, our breathing slows down, everything's kind of like slowing. And when we do ice diving, we take a ball, we put very cold water, we put ice, and we literally put our face in it for 15 seconds. Super cold, gives a shock to the system, and it mimics that diving reflex. So it just kind of like calm down the body. With physical exercise, oh, and by the way, so with temperature, you don't have to go to that extreme. You can also just take a cold shower. You can take an ice pack. You can hold ice. Another great technique is frozen oranges, is putting oranges in the freezer. And if someone is having a really hard time and are dysregulated, you take out the oranges and you just hold them really, really tight. Or taking a washcloth and just kind of like making it wet, putting a tie in it and putting it in the freezer. And then when somebody is regulated, you take it out and you help them kind of like take it apart. So we're working from the body. Physical exercise. So those will be like 10, 15 minutes of very intense physical exercise, like jumping jacks, push-ups, running up and down the stairs, anything that would get those the adrenaline, endorphins going. The heart rate will increase, but also it will release kind of like the feel-good hormones. Paced breathing. Paced breathing is a technique that activates diaphragmatic breathing. So when we're anxious or we're scared, we usually breathe kind of like shallow breathing. It's like, and get stuck right here. And we want to get the oxygen going all over the body. So in paced breathing, or some people would say square breathing, we inhale for 4, we hold for 4, we exhale for 4, we hold for 4, we inhale for 4, and we repeat it 4 times. So it's a square. Another example of paced breathing would be inhale for 1, exhale for 2, inhale for 3, exhale for 4, and all the way up to 10 and down. And by focusing on numbers and countings, you can really focus on anything else. You can really focus on your thoughts because you have to count. And then PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, that's a technique when we're tensing our muscles and then releasing them at once. And we go according to different muscle groups in our body. So, tensing our legs really, really, really tight and holding it and then letting go. And then going to our stomach and our arms and so on and so on. And the mechanism that's behind it is that sometimes we don't even notice that we're really tense until we do it. So like if all of you like want to, even right now, if you just do that, putting your shoulders up and hold it really, really tight and then let go, you're going to notice, most of you, that this area is really, really tense. So just another technique of just reducing the overall tension in the body. Self-soothe. So we basically go according to the senses. Vision would be anything that calms us down. So for me, I have a picture from Bora Bora that when I look at it, this is my happy place. I look at the water and it just calms me down. It can be colors, it can be pictures of loved ones, different things like that. Hearing. So I often tell people, have your favorite audio. So kind of like create a list of all your favorite music. For others, it might be sounds of nature. It can be heartbeats, guided meditation, audiobooks, and so on. With smell, we use peppermint, lavenders, different candles. There's actually a lot. Someone asked about association before. There is a list of things just for grounding with association. Wasabi, there's those big candies, fireballs. That's also a great one for dissociation, but it can be either for grounding or for calming down. Sense of taste, so tea, gums, mint, chocolate, and then touch. So hot and cold shower, maybe it's a blanket, maybe it's a sweater that you like, maybe it's a stuffed animal, anything that really helps you calm down. And then radical acceptance. I think it's in my opinion, it's one of the most difficult skills to achieve. At least with Anna, it was really difficult. It's accepting what happened. And radical acceptance is not forgiveness. It's not liking what happened. It's understanding that I can't change it and I can't control it, so I'm going to choose to accept it. It's the understanding that I can't control anything other than myself, so I can change myself. And I love this quote by Murakami, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So it's really helping with Anna, it was helping her understanding that she's stuck. She's self-harming again and again, and she is in and out of inpatient. So she's really, really, really suffering. And if she's more willing to use skills and is more willing to work on what happened, then the suffering will be reduced. The pain might still be there. I can't take away what happened to her, but we can help her suffer less. So this is an example of a mindfulness I used to do with her. She would sit kind of like we call it open hands, like sitting like that with someone that has a smile and thinking about an event that happened to her. It could be one of the abuse that she had or a situation with her mom, and repeating, I don't like it. I can't change it. I choose to accept it, and going over it again and again and again. With emotion regulation, so those are skills, those are long-term skills. So until now, we talked about the stress tolerance, which are the skills that right now I'm dysregulated, what am I doing? Emotion regulations are a skill more for the long run. How do I overall regulate my emotions? So it's understanding emotions, naming it, decreasing overall vulnerability, and decrease emotional suffering. So a great skill that Anna really liked was stun wave. So in stun wave, it's we're being mindful for emotions, but we're not acting on it. So it's noticing sensations, S, noticing thoughts. It's not a great acronym, by the way. I feel like they couldn't think of a better one with a T over there, but it's okay. So sensations, thoughts, urges, and then we name the emotion, and then we ride a wave. So what does that mean, ride a wave? Emotions last for about 15 seconds if we don't keep activating them. Which means if you do absolutely nothing, which none of us actually do nothing when we feel an emotion, it will get to a peak like a wave, and then it will fade away. What we as people do, we keep activating it, right? Like if you're sad, you might be listening to sad music. If you're angry at someone, you might replay that argument in your head. We keep activating and activating. So like riding the wave is we're going to notice what's going on. I'm noticing the urge of what I want to do, but I'm not going to do it. And I'm going to let the emotion fade out. That was helpful with Anna when she had urges to self-harm, for example. So those are different examples of opposite action. So opposite to an urge. So with sadness, our urges to withdraw, fear, avoid, anger would be attack, love is approach, and so on. So with opposite to it would be, if in sadness I want to withdraw, I would actually, I would get close to someone. With fear, I want to run away from the situation, I'm going to make a step toward the situation. With anger, instead of attacking someone, I'm not going to be kind to the person I want to attack, but I might find someone else and I'll do a kind act toward them. And then validation, so we want to validate emotions, actions, and cognitions. Validation is not an agreement. Validation is a skill. It's the idea of I'm understanding your point of view. I can see the wisdom in what you're feeling and what you're doing. And we used a lot of validation with Anna, and especially her stepmom. And then interpersonal effectiveness. So I'm not going to get into those skills, but we use them to really communicate, help Anna communicate to her stepmom and dad how she's feeling in a very direct way and how to get her goals met, not in a way that is running away or escalating or self-harming, but actually telling them, this is how I'm feeling and this is what I need from you. So a lot of the skills we use during also family therapy and during parent coaching. So it's an example of things that Anna tend to avoid, and we had a hierarchy of them and then try to do exposure to them one by one. Rachel, I know I'm kind of like going fast through it because I really want to.
So do you want to get to so we have about 12 minutes left. So I'm just thinking maybe.
Let's go to so let's go to the school piece.
Yeah.
Okay, trauma-informed school. Whew. Okay, so 1 out of 4 children that are attending school have experienced a traumatic event or AC. 1 out of 4 children, which means you definitely know someone who experienced a traumatic event. And we talked before about how trauma can really impact every part of the development and human experience. So when you think about school, it's going to affect your academic performance. So those are kids with lower GPA. They have higher rate of school absence, increased dropout, more suspensions and exclusion, decreased reading ability. They're going to have a hard time learning the regular way because their mind is in fight or flight. Those are the kids that when they're in the classroom, they're thinking, what is this noise outside? Is someone is going to get me? Am I going to get hurt? So it's tunnel vision about what's going on. So they can't really focus on what you're teaching in the classroom. And it can either be the kid that is can't sit still and look like they have ADHD, or it can be the kid that just seems completely numb and not being able to focus. And then you're giving them an assignment and like, what are we doing now? Where are we? Because their mind is in survival mode. They're not in their prefrontal cortex. And also think about with learning, they need to learn how to put things together, to problem solve, to remember, retrieve from memory, all of that prefrontal cortex activity that we talked about before, not working for them. So with classroom behavior, those are the kids with that have difficulty with physical boundaries. They will escalate when they're being corrected, maybe show aggression if they're criticized. They're not going to like transition. They're going to have a hard time making friends, trusting others, trusting teachers. They're going to misperceive social situation. They might isolate. Those are the class clowns. And unfortunately, we know from different researchers and studies that a lot of kids that have been traumatized are the ones that drop out of school, that are being expelled, and with expelled, they're going to end up in the juvenile system. So a way to think about it is that trauma is affecting our cognition, our social, emotional, and regulation, our survival. So people experienced by trauma, they are in their survival part of the brain. They cannot reach the cognition, which is the last part. And we're expecting them to sit in a classroom and learn just like any other kid. So there is an initiative that's called Trauma Sensitive School that basically gives a few highlights of what can you do. So first of all, it's a whole school approach, from the principal to the person in the gate, through the cafeteria person and the different administrators. Everyone should buy into that. You want to promote safety, academic, emotional, physical, social, on the way to school, on the way home, at the bus. You want to make sure that people are feeling safe. You want to connect student to the school, so the school becomes a community. When you think about a child's life, the big 2 communities that they have is family and school. So this is the big one for intervention. We want them to feel safe in that community. We want to have a welcoming environment, anything from light, posters, light plants, We want to have calm colors around. Morning greeting. So when they enter school, have a different greeting for each kid. Make sure that he's saying hi to each kid. Ask them about their day. This is connection. This shows that you care. Using mindfulness and teach self-regulation skills. So the skills that I talked about before, those can absolutely be taught in the classroom. Breakfast and lunch buddies is an initiative to basically connect with teachers from other classes and with other students. You want to provide choices and control when possible with clear expectation. So it's this balance between having firm limits, but make sure that you tell them what the limits are and have rational expectations about it. So it's not one size fits all. It's not, this is how we do things at school. You really need to see the individuals in front of you. Anticipate difficulties, consider 504 and appropriate, have comfort zone, calm corner, calm colors. This is just an example of a few school-based intervention, which you're going to have that the slides are being sent to you. And I also put a bunch of resources for people who are interested more in specific evidence-based intervention for schools. So with 1 minute about compassion fatigue, and we'll take some questions. As treaters and as parents, you might experience compassion fatigue, which is burnout with secondary trauma. So that happens when caregiver feels overwhelmed with hearing the trauma again and again. It's really important to notice that. You have a link here to assessment around it. And you want to ask yourself, as a way of increasing compassion, why am I doing what I'm doing? Are there any historical wounds with me that motivates me to do, again, giving meaning? Are you trying to find your own healing in the work? And then find ways that you think what you're doing is working for you. Take care of yourself and body, sleep hygiene, exercise, balanced eating, all of those stuff to really put the oxygen mask on you first. And then you can be helping others as well. We're going to end with this quote that I love. There is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. There is really a light in every single person that we treat and that we see in front of us.
Great. Thank you so much, Miri. If anyone has any additional questions for Miri or for Elder, please put them in the chat. We have just a few minutes. And while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I just want to remind folks that you'll get a link with an evaluation and the slides, as well as a resource sheet tomorrow. And that this webinar will also, since it was recorded, it will be posted on our website. And a huge thank you to the Miriam Fund and to Gateways for supporting this series. There is also a small group discussion next week if anybody is interested in attending and talking a little bit more about trauma and the impact that it has on our youth and how to help. It doesn't look like we have, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions.
I didn't need to rush through some of the slides, right?
You have 5 minutes left.
Let's go back. Let's talk about the brain.
But I think, so much of what, we talked about tonight is so relevant to people in all communities. And I think it's such important work. And those statistics speak for themselves, that there are kids who have experienced trauma in all of our classrooms and in all of our communities. Ellen asked, how can we find out about the small group discussion? It will be emailed to you with a sign up in the email tomorrow that has the slides and the recording. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all so much. And we appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
All right. Here we are.
I was going through removing everybody.
Yeah.
Most people
Elder,
go
you still
off.
there?
There were just a few people.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Thank
Hang
you
on.
thank you so much for sharing your story.
I thought you wanted me to do a piece at the end.
No, yours was supposed to be at the beginning. I thought you decided not to do the spoken word.
Oh no, I thought you wanted me to wait to the end.
No. Oh, I'm sorry.
Right, that was cool.
What is that? What's the spoken word?
It was just a piece I was going to do. You wanted to hear it now?
Sure.
Sure.
Yes, would love to.
Okay. How I'm doing? I'm not doing well because I'm living in a system where we set up to fail. See, statistically, I'm supposed to be dead or in jail, but I took a different route and told them I'm gonna prevail. See, I come from a city you can't go out after dark. Yeah, it's murder after murder, and I don't know where to start. And something has to change because it's breaking my heart. Yeah, I'm looking for the pieces silly falling apart. I say these babies killing babies. I'm like, how do we come to this? Then we post it on the gram, and somehow we numb to this. And something gotta change because I've had enough of this, and we killing our own people, and now we can't run from it.
That's awesome.
Wow, that was
Amazing.
amazing. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Have you written a lot of spoken word pieces?
Yeah, I guess you could say a lot.
It's an amazing way to share your